At the banquet, when my ex-husband and his new wife saw a little boy calling me mom, his eyes widened in shock. He divorced me 5 years ago for his pregnant mistress, ending our loveless arranged marriage, but he didn't know I was pregnant at the time. Now that I'm back just to attend my brother's alpha succession ceremony, I never thought my ex-husband would find my son in this situation. Alpha Enzo, Luna Catherine, thank you for coming to my brother's ceremony, I said, watching Catherine hesitate for a moment before she extended her hand and gave mine a brief shake. I stepped back, and at that moment, Enzo caught a faint sound coming from behind me. Only when his gaze met the little boy's did he look at me, tilting his head in curiosity. My eyes stayed on the child as I placed my hand on the back of his head, guiding him to greet Catherine and Enzo. The boy stood shyly by my side, and I gently ran my fingers through his hair while keeping my eyes locked with Enzo's. When I spoke next, Enzo's wolf grew more alert, and the atmosphere around him seemed to freeze. I'd like to introduce you to my son, I said, my voice trembling for a moment, Ashton. When Enzo looked at me, I had to force myself to look away from his eyes, as he was clearly shocked by my son's calling me mom. Can I talk to you two for a moment? Enzo asked, hesitating. I glanced at him, knowing he wanted to speak privately, so I nodded. Catherine, his partner and wife, refused to budge. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I shook my head at her, a slight smile curling on my lips as I glanced at the guests coming in, knowing it wasn't the time to argue with a woman like her. She had gotten what she wanted, and her lack of security was something I could never understand. Well, this is me, I said, looking down at my son, whose eyes were glued to me. How about we take you to the garden to play with the other kids? Mommy needs to stay with her guests for a bit. Ashton smiled and nodded, then waved at Enzo and Catherine. The woman's eyes lingered on him for a moment, and I couldn't help but notice the fear in her gaze. I'll be right back, Ezio, I said, and my brother nodded. I led my son outside. Mom, who's that person? He looked up at me with his beautiful blue eyes. I smiled and knelt down, brushing my fingers over his cheek. Even though I was angry with Enzo, I knew I couldn't let my son hate him. He was his father, and while he was unfortunate in that regard, I knew I couldn't make things worse for him. He's the strongest of all the alphas, an old friend of Mommy's, I said, and his eyes grew even wider. Like a superhero? He asked. I laughed. Stronger than a superhero, I replied, and his eyes lit up. I kissed his cheek and looked over at the other kids. Go ahead and play. If you need anything, I'll be inside, okay? Okay, Mom, he said, turning to join the others. I watched as they began to play with the ball, then nodded at the headmistress, who was with the nanny, making sure the kids weren't too distracted. I turned to head back inside but stopped when I saw Enzo standing at the door, silently letting me know he had overheard everything I said to my son. I frowned and quickly lowered my gaze as I walked inside. He grabbed my arm, stopping me. I took a deep breath and looked at him in confusion. Superhero? He asked, shaking his head. I pulled my arm from his grip and gave him the most sarcastic smile I could muster. I'd rather my son think his dad's a villain, don't you think? I asked bitterly. I walked past him, entering the house without saying another word. And then I found myself face to face with the woman who had started all this. Stay away from my husband, she said, and I shook my head, a smile playing at the corners of my mouth. I'm not joking. Oh, I'm sorry, I said, covering my mouth. You can keep him, you know. What's going on here? Ezio asked, and I noticed a